Step away from that bed. This is a restricted wing, and I have asked you politely, twice. You stopped being polite the moment you put your hands on my mother's oxygen line. You've been hostile since you walked onto this floor. Every person here saw it. Every person here saw a woman with a clipboard decide whose name was worth keeping. You think a dusty jacket and a quiet voice make you somebody in this hospital? No, but the note that holds this hospital's debt does. Never mistake a quiet man for a powerless one. Some men don't announce what they own. They wait patiently to see how you treat the people who own nothing. At 2:04 in the morning, the sleet came off Lake Erie sideways and hit the glass doors of Beaumont Grace Medical Center like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the lobby was warm and expensive and almost empty. A fireplace that burned nothing glowed orange behind a slab of gray marble. There were orchids on the reception desk, real ones, replaced every Tuesday by a florist on retainer. There was a coffee bar that didn't open until 6, and a wall of donor names etched in brushed steel, each letter deep enough to catch a shadow. Terrence Vaughn came through the doors with sleet melting in his hair and plaster dust on his boots. He was 39 years old, 6 feet even, built like a man who still carried things himself. He wore a canvas work jacket the color of wet sand, a gray thermal shirt, and jeans that had lost their shape somewhere around the second winter. There was drywall compound, dried white, across his right knuckle. He had been on his knees in the basement of a free clinic in Slavic Village 6 hours earlier, tearing out water-damaged studs alongside 11 volunteers, and a retired plumber named Ollie, because the clinic's foundation grant had covered materials but not labor, and Terrence had never believed a man should sign a check for something he wasn't willing to touch. His phone had buzzed at 11:47 p.m. His aunt, Lucille. Your mother collapsed at the church. They took her to Beaumont Grace. He hadn't changed clothes. He hadn't gone home. He had driven straight through the sleet with the radio off, and he was carrying nothing but a phone, a wallet, and the particular cold that lives in a man's chest when the person who raised him is somewhere in a building he cannot see into. Chelsea Marr was 24, 3 months into the night desk, and she had learned in those 3 months exactly what Beaumont Grace paid her to learn. She looked up from a laptop where a true crime podcast played at half speed. She saw the jacket. She saw the boots. She saw a black man alone at 2 in the morning with dust on his hands, and she assembled the whole story before he said a word. Deliveries are around the east side, she said, and charity intake doesn't open till 7. Terrence stopped. The lobby was so quiet he could hear the fake fire clicking. My mother was brought in tonight, he said. His voice was low, unhurried. Odessa Vaughn, 71. Chelsea's mouth moved, a small correction, not an apology. She typed. She waited. Her face did something complicated when the screen loaded, a flicker quickly buried. 7 West, she said. Elevators past the fireplace. She did not say, I'm sorry. She did not say, I hope she's all right. She printed a visitor badge and slid it across the marble without looking up, the way you'd slide a receipt to someone you'd already forgotten. Terrence took it. Thank you, he said, and meant it, which somehow made it worse. He walked toward the elevators. Behind him, Chelsea Marr watched the back of his jacket and felt a small hot thing move under her ribs that she would spend the next 3 days pretending was indigestion. She did not know that Terrence Vaughn had founded Halcyon Ridge Partners 11 years ago in a rented office above a nail salon in Shaker Heights. She did not know that Halcyon Ridge now managed $9 billion, most of it in distressed healthcare debt, and that its founder had a reputation in Chicago and New York for buying broken hospital systems the way other men bought classic cars, quietly, patiently, and only when the owner had run out of ways to hide the rust. She did not know that Beaumont Grace Health System had been sliding toward insolvency for 4 years, that its bond covenants had been breached twice, that Halcyon Ridge held the senior note, that there was a letter of intent signed in November, sitting in a folder in Cleveland, and a board vote scheduled for 9 o'clock that same morning, 7 hours away. And she certainly did not know that Odessa Vaughn had worked 31 years in the laundry of this hospital system, that she had pushed carts of soiled linen down these same corridors when the building was still called Beaumont Charity, that she had raised a son on that wage and never once let him see her cry about it. The elevator doors closed. Terrence watched the numbers climb and felt the building around him, the hum of it, the money in the walls, the orchids, and thought about the diligence memo on his tablet at home. Page 41. A red-flagged section his analysts had titled Controlled Substance Variance and Triage Coding Anomalies, unresolved, and beneath it, a note from Ruth. Anonymous letter received Nov 12, postmarked Cleveland, unsigned, flagging systematic acuity downgrades in the uninsured population. Credible detail. No corroboration. He had read that letter 4 times. He had wondered who wrote it and why they were too afraid to sign their name. The elevator opened on 7 West. The 7th floor of Beaumont Grace was where the hospital kept the money. The east wing held the private suites. Hardwood floors, a concierge menu, a sitting area for family with a view of the lake on days the lake could be seen. The west wing held everyone else. Shared rooms, curtains instead of doors, monitors chirping in a language of small alarms. Nobody had time to answer. Marianne Kessler ran both. She was 48, director of nursing, 22 years at Beaumont Grace, and she had built her entire self out of control. Her scrubs were pressed. Her badge hung at the exact center of her sternum. She knew which cardiologist wanted his coffee at 5:15 and which donor's wife needed to be called Mrs. She knew how to smile at money, and she knew, with a precision that had never failed her, who in a corridor could hurt her and who could not. At 2:11 a.m. she was standing at the intersection of the 2 wings with a clipboard against her hip, and she saw a man in a work jacket step off the elevator with dust on his boots. Something in her went taut and pleased. This was the part of the job she was good at. "Sir." She moved into the corridor. "Service entrance is on the ground floor. Housekeeping doesn't come up this way." Terrence stopped. The silence that opened around them was the kind that pretends to be an accident. "I'm here for a patient," he said. 7:12. Odessa Vaughn. Marianne tilted her head. She looked at him the way a person reads a form that has been filled out wrong. Visiting hours ended at 8. She was admitted tonight. "Do you have a badge?" He held it up. She took it. She did not take it the way you take a piece of paper. She took it the way you take evidence. 2 fingers, wrist stiff. She read the name. T. Vaughn, visitor, 7W, printed at 2:06 a.m. valid. For half a second, something in her expression shifted and then closed like a door in a draft. "Fine." She handed it back without meeting his eyes. She gestured down the west corridor with a movement so sharp it could have cut cloth. "Rooms on the left, and keep your voice down. Judge Pruitt is resting in the East Suite." Harlan Pruitt was 76. A retired federal judge, silver-haired, in the hospital for a stent and a bad attitude about it. He had heard the whole exchange through his open door. He set down the crossword he wasn't finishing and turned his head slightly toward the corridor. Marianne's face changed when she looked at the judge's doorway. It warmed, it performed. Then she turned back to Terrence, and the warmth was simply gone, like a lamp unplugged. He walked past her. Behind the nurse's station, Nadia Serrano watched from behind a cart of saline bags. She was 26, 2 years off orientation, still paying $640 a month on student loans, still wiring money home to her mother in Toledo. She was old enough to know that Marianne Kessler could end a nursing career with 3 sentences in a personnel file, and never raise her voice doing it. Nadia's fingers tightened around a clipboard. She wanted to say something. She did not. Marianne leaned toward her, pitching her voice low enough to deny and loud enough to land. "Watch that room." Family like that always shows up in the middle of the night when there's a settlement in it. Nadia went pale. Terrence, 11 feet down the hall, heard every word. He did not turn around, he did not slow, but inside his chest, something quiet and structural shifted, the way a beam shifts before anyone hears the ceiling. Down the corridor, Samuel Obeng leaned on his mop handle and watched the whole thing. He was 63. He had come from Kumasi in 1989 and had worked nights in this building since 1994. He had been the only person that evening who had said "Good evening, sir" to the man in the work jacket, and he had noticed that the man had said it back and used his name, because Samuel wore a name tag and almost nobody read it. Samuel bent his head and kept mopping. Room 712 had 2 beds and 1 window, and a curtain between them that didn't quite close. Odessa Vaughn was in the bed by the door. She was 71 years old, small under the blanket, an oxygen cannula at her nose, and a plastic clip on her finger. Her hands were folded on her chest the way they folded in church. Her grey hair was pressed flat on one side. Someone had taken her earrings off and left them in a paper cup on the tray table. She had collapsed during the second hymn at Mount Zion Baptist, and Sister Lucille had held her head off the floor and prayed out loud in front of 200 people. Terrence stood in the doorway for a moment and let himself be a son. Then he pulled the chair over and sat and put his hand around her wrist, and he read the monitor because he had been reading monitors since he was 19, and his father was dying in a hospital 40 miles from here, in a room with no window at all. Heart rate 118, oxygen saturation 89, blood pressure low. He reached for the chart hanging on the footboard. Beaumont Grace still used a paper intake sheet, printed, clipped, and then scanned. He'd read 1,000 of them in diligence. Emergency Department Triage, Level 2 Emergent, time-stamped 12:31 a.m., and below it, a second line. Reassessment at 1:52 a.m. Level 4, less urgent, initialed. MK. Below that, a handwritten note, removed from 540 OR board. Reassigned to next available. Terrence read it 3 times. His mother had been scheduled for a procedure at 5:40 in the morning. 22 minutes before he walked through the lobby doors, somebody had taken her off the board. He looked at the second bed, behind the curtain that didn't quite close. An old woman lay there, alone, no flowers, no chair pulled up, breathing in the shallow way people breathe when there's nobody to breathe for. The name on the whiteboard said A. Re. Under it, in the same handwriting, the same word. Reassign. Terrence set the chart down very carefully, the way you set down something you don't trust yourself to hold. Marianne Kessler came through the door with her clipboard and did not knock. "You can't touch that." She crossed the room and took the chart off the footboard, and she took it fast, and the corner of it caught the pulse oximeter cable running from Odessa's finger to the monitor. The cable snapped taut. The clip came loose. It skittered across the blanket and dropped, and the oxygen line was tangled with it, and the cannula slid off Odessa's face and lay on her cheek, and the monitor above the bed began to shriek. Odessa's eyes opened, not wide. Just enough. Her mouth worked once. For 1 second nobody moved. Then Marianne said, "Oops." Flat, empty, almost pleased. Terrence was on his feet. He reached across the bed, caught the cannula, seated it back at his mother's nose, and pressed the clip onto her finger with the steadiness of a man diffusing something. The number on the monitor climbed 84, 86, 88. The alarm quieted to a chirp, and then to nothing. He did not raise his voice. "Her SAT dropped to 84, he said. "It'll come back up." Marianne tucked the chart under her arm. "Machines are dramatic. She's a level 2. Something crossed Marianne's face. It was very fast. "She's a 4, she said. She was a 2 at 12:31. Someone made her a 4 at 1:52. Someone with your initials," he looked at her, "and someone took her off the 540 board." Marianne laughed. One short note through her nose. It was not a laugh. It was worse. It was a woman who had never once in 22 years had to explain herself to somebody who looked like him. "Sir," she said, "I'm sure you watch a lot of television, but acuity coding is a clinical judgment, and you're a—" She let her eyes go to the boots, the jacket, the dust on his knuckles, and finished the sentence without finishing it. "I'm her son. Then sit down and be her son." Across the hall, Nadia Serrano stood frozen at the med cart with a warm blanket in her arms. She could have taken 4 steps. She could have walked in, straightened the cannula, checked the SAT, said, "The reassessment looks wrong. Let me page respiratory 4 steps." She had rehearsed sentences like that in her car in the parking garage. Marianne's eyes cut toward her through the doorway. Nadia stayed where she was. Judge Harlan Pruitt appeared in his own doorway across the corridor, holding his IV pole, wearing a hospital gown and his own reading glasses, and he did not say anything yet. He only watched, and he had watched people lie for 31 years from a bench, and he knew what the pitch of a voice does when it starts to slide. Terrence looked down at his mother. She had gone under again. Her hand was cold, he said quietly. "That chart is the difference between her having a heart and not having one by morning." Marian shifted the clipboard against her hip. "People like you always show up when there's money on the table." The room went very still. Nadia flinched out in the hall, as if the words had touched her skin. Judge Pruitt's hand tightened on the IV pole. Terrence lifted his eyes, and for the first time all night, the calm in them did not look like patience. It looked like weather coming in over the water. "You should think carefully about your next sentence," he said. Marianne straightened. Her cheeks colored. "Or what?" He didn't answer right away. He reached over, took the edge of his mother's blanket, and drew it up over her shoulder, smoothing it once with his palm. Then he said, very softly, "Or this becomes the night your hospital finds out what it's been protecting." Marian Kessler heard a threat, and she heard it wrong. For 22 years, she had survived in corridors by understanding one thing better than anyone. Authority is not always earned. Often it is simply performed. A raised eyebrow, a clipboard held like a shield, a sentence begun before someone else has finished theirs. People obeyed because the scrubs told them to. Terrence Vaughn didn't obey. He sat there with dust on his hands and a dying woman's wrist under his fingers, and his eyes did not rise in anger, and that unsettled her more than shouting ever could have. Shouting she knew, shouting she could document. Calm men were dangerous. There was a second right then, when Marianne Kessler was almost a person. It came and went in less time than it takes to close a door. She had been on shift for 14 hours. Her daughter had texted at 9 and again at 11, and she had not answered either time. Her own mother was in a memory care facility in Parma that cost $4,200 a month, and the administrator had called Tuesday about a rate increase. And Marianne had sat in her car in the garage with the engine off and done arithmetic until her hands shook. She was tired. She was frightened. She had been frightened for a long time, and she looked at the man in the work jacket, and she chose, the way she had chosen 100 times before, to feel large by making someone else small. "Get out of this room," she said. Terrence stood, not fast. He was not a big man in the way, Doctor. Grant Holloway was big, filling doorways with bulk and volume. His power lived in his stillness, the set of his shoulders, the way he took up exactly the space. He occupied, and no more. "I'm going to the nurse's station," he said. "I want the attending, and I want the reassessment reviewed." He moved to step past her. The gap between the bed and the wall was narrow. His sleeve brushed her forearm. Nothing. A whisper of canvas. Marianne gasped like she'd been struck. "Don't you touch me?" He stopped instantly. "I didn't." She saw the judge in the doorway. She saw Nadia's white face. She saw a night shift full of eyes, and she felt the floor of her authority go soft beneath her. And so she reached for the only thing she had left. She planted both hands on his chest and shoved. He wasn't braced. His heel caught the base of the chair. His shoulder went into the corner of the crash cart, hard, and his temple clipped the edge of the wall-mounted glove dispenser. and the sound it made was small and flat and would stay in Nadia Serrano's ears for the rest of her life. He went down on one knee. A red line opened above his eyebrow. Nadia dropped the blanket. Marianne stood over him, breathing fast, and for one full second there was something on her face that could only be called triumph. Then Terrence Vaughn slowly stood back up. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't curse. He didn't step back. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out his phone, and tapped the screen once. "You put your hands on me," he said, and Marianne's face changed. Everyone saw it change. The fear arrived first, and then the calculation, and then the rewrite. She clutched her own wrist and screamed. "He grabbed me. He grabbed me. Somebody call security." "Security," Nadia whispered. "Marianne, no." But Marianne was already crying, and the tears came fast. Too fast, the way a curtain drops when a stagehand has been waiting for the cue. "Doctor." Grant Holloway came down the corridor from the physician's lounge with the heavy stride of a man interrupted. He was 57, chief of medicine, thick through the shoulders, red across the face, and certain of himself in the way men become when nobody has told them no since 1998. Behind him came Dale Kirby from security, 41 radio on his shoulder, a former deputy, who had washed out of the sheriff's department for reasons that had never gone into any file. Holloway's eyes went first to Marianne, who was trembling with a hand pressed to her wrist, then to Terrence, who stood beside a hospital bed with blood on his eyebrow and a phone in his hand. He made his decision before anyone opened their mouth. "What is going on here?" Marian pulled in a broken breath. "He pushed past me. I told him to leave, and he became aggressive. He grabbed my arm." "That isn't true," Terrence said. His voice was low and level, and it landed strangely in that corridor, too controlled for the moment, and Judge Pruitt heard it, and something in the old man's spine straightened. Marianne pointed. "Look at him. He's been hostile since he walked in. He's been threatening me. I was afraid." Holloway turned. "Sir, I need you to step back and sit down." Terrence didn't move. "Your nursing director put her hands on my chest and shoved me into that cart." Holloway glanced at the cut above his eye and then looked away, the way a man looks away from a fact that has arrived at an inconvenient hour. "My director says you assaulted her." "Doctor." Judge Pruitt came out into the hallway, in his gown and his socks, dragging the IV pole. "I saw the entire thing from that doorway." Mr. Vaughn touched no one. She struck him. She struck him with both hands. Marianne snapped her head around, panic flickering under the tears. "Judge Pruitt, I know this was frightening, but from your angle you may not have seen." "I saw enough," Pruitt said. "I sat on the federal bench for 31 years, and I know a rehearsed sentence when I hear one. And you have said I was afraid 3 times without once looking afraid." Holloway felt the corridor shift under him. He hated it. A hospital was not a courtroom. Nobody debated a chief of medicine. He stepped closer to Terrence and dropped his voice. "Sit down, or I'll have Mr. Kirby remove you, and I'll have Cleveland police meet you at the door." "Removed," Terrence said, "for being assaulted, for creating a disturbance in my hospital." My hospital. It hung there, small, enormously revealing. Nadia had come to the edge of the nurse's station. Her hands were shaking. So badly, she pressed them flat against the counter. She had heard the sound of his head hitting the wall. She had seen the reassessment sheet at 1:52. She had been standing right there when Marianne wrote level 4 in a hand, so steady it made Nadia sick. She opened her mouth, her throat locked. Marianne had trained that lock into her over 18 months. One bad evaluation, one whispered word to the scheduler, one shift cut to 28 hours, so the benefits fell away. That was all it took to break a 26-year-old with student loans and a mother in Toledo. Terrence looked past Holloway. He looked at Nadia, not accusing, not begging. He simply saw her. And somehow that was worse than anything Marianne had ever done. Terrence turned back. He glanced through the open door of 7 and 12, where his mother lay with her hands folded on her chest. "Doctor," he said. At 12:31, an emergency physician assessed Odessa Vaughn as level 2 and put her on the 540 board. At 1:52, your nursing director downgraded her to level 4 and pulled her off the board. She has a SAT of 89 and a heart rate of 118, and she is 71 years old. Holloway's jaw moved. Charting is a clinical decision. She's on the board or she isn't. Terrence looked at his watch. It was an old Timex on a cracked leather band. It said 2:14. "Dr. Holloway," he said, "you have made a serious mistake and you have 2 minutes to correct it. Put her name back on that board." Holloway leaned in. His breath smelled like coffee and something else. "Is that a threat?" Terrence unlocked his phone with his thumb. "No," he said. "It's a courtesy." And for the first time in his adult life, Grant Holloway felt something move under his certainty. It wasn't fear yet. It was recognition, because the man in the work jacket wasn't pleading, he wasn't explaining, he wasn't panicking, he was placing a call. Ruth Kaplan answered on the second ring. She was 44, Halcyon Ridge's general counsel, and she had been asleep in Rocky River for 4 hours. "Terrence, it's 2 in the morning. The vote's at 9. Move it up." A pause. She sat up. She turned on the lamp. In 11 years, she had learned that when Terrence Vaughn's voice got quieter, the ground was about to move. To when? Now. Keys started clicking. "Talk. Beaumont Grace. Senior note. The November LOI. The conversion trigger on the 22 facility. We have the signatures. We have the covenant breach documented twice. What I want is the voting position, tonight before this shift changes. We have the note. We've had the note. The only question is the Whitcomb Foundation block. Call them." "Terrence, it's 2 in the morning, and if we call them at 2 in the morning, we are announcing that something is wrong." Something is wrong. Ruth stopped typing. She heard behind his voice a monitor chirping. She heard a woman crying theatrically somewhere down a hall. "Where are you?" she said. 7 West. Ruth Kaplan closed her eyes. "Oh no, Odessa? She's alive." Ruth exhaled once, and then she was all business, because that is what he paid her for, and it was also what she would have done for free. "Whitcomb will want a premium. Give it to them." "That's expensive." "So is this," Terrence said, and hung up. Down the corridor, Marianne Kessler stood with her arms wrapped around herself. She watched him lower the phone. She watched Judge Pruitt watching him. She watched Holloway's shoulders, and she saw that the chief of medicine had stopped talking, and she felt, for the first time in 22 years, that she could not read a room. "Who were you calling?" she demanded. Terrence didn't answer. He sat back down in the chair beside his mother's bed. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a verdict waiting to be read aloud. Nadia Serrano came out from behind the counter. She walked down the hall on legs that didn't feel like hers. She had an instant cold pack in her hand, the kind you crack and shake. She had gotten it out of the supply cart without deciding to. Marianne saw her. "Nadia, don't." Nadia kept walking. She stopped at the doorway of 712. Terrence looked up. Blood had run down to his eyebrow and dried. She didn't say anything. She cracked the pack, shook it, and held it out. He took it. Their hands didn't touch. "Thank you," he said. Nadia's chin trembled. She looked at the floor. Then she went back to the nurse's station and stood with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes closed, and Marianne Kessler said something to her, low and vicious, and Nadia did not answer. She did not go back into the room. Not yet. At 2:19 a.m., the phone at the nurse's station rang. It was the interior line. Nobody called the interior line at 2:19 in the morning. Holloway picked it up because he was standing closest, and because he still believed the machine existed to protect him, as it always had. "This is Dr. Holloway." The voice on the other end belonged to Beaumont Grace's chief operating officer, and it came through tight and thin and out of breath, as though the man were pulling on pants while he spoke. "Grant, whatever is happening on 7 West, it stops right now." Holloway turned his back to the corridor. "We have an aggressive visitor. Grant, Listen to me. Do not involve police. Do not remove anyone. Do not discipline anyone. Do not so much as raise your voice. On what authority? As of 11 minutes ago, Halcyon Ridge Partners holds a controlling voting position in this health system. The board is in emergency session. Their council has issued an evidence preservation order across every server we own. Holloway said nothing. Grant, the voice cracked. The man in 712. Do you know who that is? Holloway turned slowly and looked down the corridor through the open door of room 712 at a man in a work jacket sitting beside a sleeping woman, pressing a cold pack to his own head. Grant, that is Terrence Vaughn. The receiver was suddenly very heavy. Behind him, the floor hummed on, indifferent, full of small alarms nobody was answering. Holloway hung up. He stood there with his hand still on the phone. When he turned around, all the red had drained out of his face and left something grey behind, and Marianne Kessler saw it and felt the first true terror of her adult life. Doctor? She said. Are we calling the police? He didn't answer. That silence told her more than a sentence could have. Terrence stood up in the doorway of 712, the cold pack in one hand. Put my mother back on the board, he said. Holloway swallowed. It's done. Respiratory is on the way up. Cardiothoracic is being paged. Marian's mouth opened. But he assaulted. You shoved him, Judge Pruitt said, from his doorway. And that young woman recorded the last 40 seconds of it, unless I'm badly mistaken. At the far end of the hall, an aide in scrubs lowered a phone she'd been holding at her hip. Marianne turned in a slow circle and, for the first time, saw the corridor clearly. Not as her kingdom. As witnesses. Phones. Memory. Evidence. Terrence took 2 steps into the hallway. He looked at Marianne, then at Holloway, then at the nurse's station. Dr. Holloway, he said. Before anybody leaves this floor tonight, nobody touches the Pyxis in 7 West. The building itself seemed to stop. Holloway's head came up sharply. What did you say? And Terrence saw it move across the chief of medicine's face. A flash, too quick for most people. It wasn't confusion. It was fear. Not about a shove. About something underneath. Pruitt saw it too and leaned forward on his IV pole. Nadia Serrano's hand went to her mouth. Terrence's voice dropped until it barely carried. Yes, doctor, he said. I know about the cabinet. Behind the orchids and the donor wall, and the fireplace that burned nothing, something criminal had just taken its first breath in open air, and every person on that floor felt the night turn into something much larger than one shove. Nadia knew. Every nurse on nights knew, the way people know things they have agreed not to know. The automated medication cabinet in 7 West had a broken override log. It had been broken for 7 months. Waste witnesses were being signed off by people who hadn't been in the room. Fentanyl vials came out full and went into the Sharps container empty, and nobody could say for certain what had happened in between, because the log that would have said it had been pending IT remediation. Since the previous June, Marianne Kessler called it streamlined workflow. Everyone else called it not your business, and Marianne Kessler was the only person on 7 West with an unrestricted override code. Terrence looked at the young nurse standing at the counter with both hands flat on it. Mrs. Serrano, he said. Nadia flinched at the sound of her own name. Marianne moved fast. She doesn't know anything. How long has the override log in that cabinet been down? She doesn't know. How long? Nadia looked at Marianne. She looked at Holloway, she looked at her own hands and saw her mother's kitchen in Toledo and her loan balance and every single thing she had been afraid of losing. Then she looked at the cut above Terrence Vaughn's eyebrow and at the ice pack he was still holding, the one she had given him because her body had decided before her courage did. 7 months, she said. Marianne hissed her name. Maybe longer. Nadia's voice cracked and then steadied, because fear, once it breaks, becomes a different substance entirely. We were told to stop putting it in the shift report. She said I'd already knew. She said, If it kept showing up in the report, it would trigger a joint commission look, and we'd all lose our jobs. Holloway closed his eyes. And the acuity coding, Terrence said. The reassessments. Nadia's tears came then, silent, running straight down without her face moving at all. Only the ones without insurance, she whispered. Only the ones with no family in the room. The suites need beds. Level 2 patients get beds. So they get reassessed at 1 in the morning, and they get moved to 4, and they wait. Mrs. Ruiz in 712 has been waiting 9 hours. Nobody's coming for her. Nobody ever comes for her. The word nobody went through Terrence Vaughn like a nail. Who wrote the letter, he said. Nadia's head came up. The letter, he said again. Postmarked Cleveland. November 12th. No signature. 4 pages, handwritten, with the cabinet serial number on page 3. Marianne looked from Terrence to Nadia and back, and did not understand yet, and then did. Nadia Serrano stood in the middle of the corridor, 26 years old, $640 a month, a mother in Toledo, and said the bravest thing she would ever say. I did. Terrence let out a breath he hadn't known he was keeping. I've read it 4 times, he said. It was the reason I bought this hospital. At 3:40 a.m., 3 unmarked cars and a black SUV pulled up under the ambulance canopy on the north side of Beaumont Grace, and the sleet came down through the floodlights like static. They did not come to the lobby. They came up the service elevator. Special Agent Deborah Cortez of the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General stepped off with 2 DEA diversion investigators behind her. She was 50, gray at the temple, and she had been awake since Ruth Kaplan called her personal cell at 2:31. Mr. Vaughn. Terrence stood. Agent Cortez, we have your counsel's package. She looked at the dried blood on his temple and then, for a beat longer than necessary, at Marianne Kessler. 7 West Pixis, Terrence said. Override log offline since June. Miss Serrano has the shift reports before they were pulled. Reassessment sheets for the last 14 months are in the scanning queue on the 3rd floor, and the paper copies are in a box behind the intake printer, which nobody has ever emptied, which is the only reason any of this is provable. Who has override authority? 1 person. Marian stepped forward. Her face was white, and her eyes were bright, and her voice climbed the way it had climbed all night. This is insane. He attacked me. He came in here at 2 in the morning, and he put his hands on me, and now he's manipulating all of you. Agent Cortez looked at the man's cut eyebrow, then at Marianne's unmarked wrists. Ma'am, she said. Sit down. I'm the victim here. No, said Judge Harlan Pruitt from his doorway. You are not. The aide at the end of the hall lifted her phone. I have video. Samuel Obeng, leaning on his mop by the linen closet, straightened. I saw, he said in his careful, deliberate English. I saw everything, and I will say so. For 31 years I have said nothing. Tonight, I will say so. Nadia stepped up beside him. So will I, she said, and I can tell you exactly which charts were changed, and when, and by whom. Marian turned on her with something in her face that was no longer human. You little traitor. Nadia's voice shook. It did not retreat. No, she said. I'm just done being afraid of you. The words stopped Marianne Kessler cold, the way a wall stops a car. Terrence looked at her one more time. I'll say this once, he said. There's a woman in the next bed named Alma Ruiz. She's been on the floor 9 hours. You moved her name too. If you tell Agent Cortez the truth right now, all of it. The cabinet, the coding, who told you to do it and who looked away. I will personally see that it's noted. Marian's jaw worked, her eyes darted to Holloway, who would not look at her. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Terrence nodded slowly, as though something he'd hoped against had been confirmed. Ask her again, he said to Cortez. Cortez asked her again. Marianne Kessler lied a second time, and then it was over, and there was nothing left in the room but paperwork. Grant Holloway did not lie. Something had come apart in him at 2:19 with a telephone in his hand, and when Cortez turned to him he said, in a voice nobody on that floor had heard before, I signed the variance waivers. I knew about the log. I told the COO in March, and he told me to leave it in ICU. He put his hands on the counter. I'll give you everything. They walked him out without cuffs. It was Terrence who told them to. Judge Pruitt watched him go and said nothing. And later, in his deposition, he would say that watching a man be permitted his dignity, while losing everything else, was the most disquieting thing he had ever seen in a hallway. Marianne screamed when the cuffs closed. "You can't do this to me. I gave this hospital 22 years. Terrence watched her go without any satisfaction at all. "You had 22 years, he said, to learn that a chart is a person. What you learned was how to move a name." At 5:40 in the morning, Odessa Vaughn went into an operating room on the 4th floor of Beaumont Grace Medical Center, where she had once pushed a laundry cart, and at 8:52 she came out of it alive. At 7:15, Alma Ruiz went in behind her. 3 days later, Terrence Vaughn walked into the Beaumont Grace boardroom on East 9th Street, wearing a charcoal suit and the same unreadable calm he had carried in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed. The room had a glass wall facing the lake. The water was the color of an old nickel. 14 executives sat around a table of book-matched walnut and pretended they were not afraid. They had seen the video, all 11 million views of it. They had watched Marianne Kessler walked out through the ambulance bay in the sleet. They had read the first federal filings, controlled substance diversion, falsified acuity records, retaliation against employees who filed intentional complaints that had been marked, resolved without a single interview conducted. Now they watched Terrence Vaughn take the chair at the head of the table without asking anyone's permission. Ruth Kaplan stood at the screen and put up the numbers. Debt exposure, legal reserve, brand valuation, which had a minus sign in front of it. 61 discrimination complaints filed by patients over 9 years. 61 closures. 0 investigations. Every slide landed like a door locking somewhere in the building. A silver-haired director named Weldon Pierce cleared his throat. "Mr. Vaughn, surely a transition of this magnitude can be handled with a certain amount of discretion." Terrence looked at him for a long moment. "Discretion," he said, "is the disease." Nobody spoke after that. He set a single folder on the table. It was very thin. "Effective this morning, the executive committee is dissolved. Any officer connected to the coding program, the cabinet, or a retaliatory scheduling decision is terminated pending review. Every discrimination complaint filed since 2016 is reopened. Every employee who was punished for telling the truth will be contacted by counsel, at my expense, and offered reinstatement." He turned the folder around and slid it toward Pierce. "The system will be recapitalized and renamed. Northlight Health. New leadership. Independent compliance. Ethics review with teeth from the loading dock to the C-suite." Weldon Pierce pushed back from the table, but the fight had already gone out of him somewhere around. Slide 4. Terrence looked toward the door. Nadia Serrano came in. She was wearing a navy blazer she'd bought at an outlet mall in Aurora on Sunday, and she had put her hair up twice and taken it down twice, and she stood in that boardroom looking exactly like what she was, a woman who had survived being afraid and had decided not to go back. "Miss Serrano will serve as Vice President of Patient Advocacy," Terrence said. "She will report to the board, not to me, not to anyone in this room." The table stirred. Pierce made a sound that was almost a laugh. "With respect, she's a floor nurse. 2 years' experience." Terrence's eyes came around. She wrote a 4-page letter to a stranger with $9 billion and no reason to read it, knowing it could end her career. And she signed nothing because she had nothing to protect her. He let that sit. She was the only person on that floor who chose the truth when silence was cheaper. That makes her better qualified than anyone at this table, including me. Nadia's eyes filled. She did not look away. Samuel Obeng was in the room too, in a suit his wife had pressed at 4 in the afternoon, holding a small cup of coffee he did not drink. When Terrence introduced him, 31 years, nights, the only man in that building who read a name tag and used a name, Samuel stood up because he thought he was supposed to, and the room applauded, and he sat back down and looked at his hands. Chelsea Marr was not fired. She had written a letter of her own, 4 days after that night, 3 paragraphs long, badly punctuated, and she had walked it up to 7 West herself because she was too ashamed to send it. It said, "I looked at his boots. I looked at his hands. I said the words before I thought them. I have been saying them since I was 19, and I don't know who taught me." Terrence read it twice. He put her in the front lobby of the reopened Slavic Village clinic on the day shift, at the same wage, and told her nothing about second chances. She still works there. Weeks later, on a Tuesday, the sign came down off the front of the building on East 9th. They put the new one up in the afternoon, clean lettering, deep blue, no orchids. Underneath the name, in letters small enough that you had to actually stop and look, they carved 4 words into the stone. Every name is a person. Odessa Vaughn came to see it. She was in a wheelchair because her son insisted, and she was furious about it because she was 71, not dead. She had her earrings back in. She wore her church coat. She looked up at the wall a long time. Then she looked at the doors, the ones she'd gone through 6 days a week for 31 years, on the side of the building where the laundry used to be. "They never once said my name in there," she said. 31 years. Not once. Terrence crouched down beside the chair in his work jacket, the way he did when he wasn't being anybody in particular. "They will now," he said. Odessa put her hand on the side of his face, over the place where the scar was, the small white line above his eyebrow that would never quite go away, and she didn't say anything at all. Inside, in a shared room on the 7th floor, a nurse named Nadia Serrano was sitting on the edge of a bed, holding the hand of a woman named Alma Ruiz, who had nobody, and who was going home on Friday. There was no video of that. There never is. And that, in the end, was the whole thing. The part the 11 million views never touched. A man in a dusty jacket had not been dangerous because he was rich. He had been dangerous because he had spent his entire life being looked at the way Chelsea Marr looked at him. And he had never once forgotten what it cost the people who could not buy their way out of that look. Power isn't proven by ruining someone who was already frightened. It's proven by tearing down the room that taught them it was safe. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more from Crimson Justice Stories. And tell us where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe nobody should have to become somebody before they're treated like somebody, comment 3 words. Every name matters.